Let's begin with the contradiction that confuses so many. How can a man crave you and still go completely silent? It seems illogical at first. We tend to associate desire with action. If someone truly wants something, don't they pursue it? Don't they at least try? But what we often overlook is the psychological reality that craving doesn't automatically translate into courage. In fact, the intensity of desire can, paradoxically, this isn't weakness in a conventional sense. This is fear masquerading as silence. Men, especially in our culture, are frequently taught from a young age to associate emotional vulnerability with shame. Not consciously, perhaps, but through thousands of subtle cues. Don't cry. Toughen up. Be a man. So when a man is confronted with a feeling that is too big, too consuming, when he meets someone who doesn't just stir attraction, but something deeper, something that unsettles the very structure of how he views himself, his instinct often is not to lean in, it's to withdraw. There's a difference between wanting someone and being ready for the implications of that want. Craving, you might be the most honest emotional signal he has felt in years, but that doesn't mean he's equipped to act on it. In fact, the more he craves you, the more his internal equilibrium is disrupted. You become a source of psychological dissonance. Why? Because you awaken a hunger he cannot ignore, yet also cannot explain or contain. He is not just dealing with the desire for a relationship. He is dealing with the existential threat that you might see through him, that you might actually reach the parts of him he's hidden from the world. Now, let me be clear. This isn't about making excuses for emotional immaturity or avoidance. It's about understanding what silence really represents. Silence in this context is not the absence of interest. It's the presence of internal chaos. It's the emotional equivalent of being frozen at the edge of a cliff, where stepping forward feels like falling. It's not that he doesn't want to speak. It's that speaking would require him to confront his own inadequacy, his own confusion, his own fear of being seen as weak or foolish. And for some men, that confrontation is too high a price, at least for now. So the question becomes, what do you do with that silence? Do you chase it, decode it, wait for it to end? Or do you realize that his craving, while real, is not your responsibility to manage? Desire is not the same thing as readiness. And craving without action is not love. It's potential trapped in fear. If a man craves you but chooses silence, he's not choosing you, he's choosing comfort. And that should tell you everything you need to know. You are not here to be the object of someone's hidden longing. You are here to be met, seen, and chosen. Out loud. Let's take a closer look at something that's often overlooked when we try to interpret silence in men: social conditioning. When a man goes quiet, especially in the presence of deep emotional attraction, we tend to assume it's a conscious choice. We say he's playing games, he's emotionally unavailable, or he's just not that interested. And yes, in some cases that might be true. But there's a deeper layer that many people miss. Much of male silence is not calculated, it's conditioned. From an early age, boys are bombarded with a very specific and often restrictive emotional script. They're taught, explicitly and implicitly, that expressing vulnerability is dangerous, that feelings are a liability, that real men are stoic, in control, unshakable. Crying becomes shameful. Needing someone becomes weak. Admitting confusion or longing is viewed as emasculating. Now, think about what that does over time. Imagine what happens to a young boy who grows into a man believing that emotional openness will cost him his dignity. So when that man meets someone who moves him, who awakens something in him that's raw and real, his instinct may not be to move forward, but to retreat. Not because he doesn't feel, but because he never learned how to feel and still stand tall. He was never given the tools to express desire without feeling exposed. His silence then is not apathy. It's learned armor, a survival mechanism in a culture that punishes emotional expression in men while paradoxically demanding it from them in relationships. And this is where things get complicated, because we live in a time where emotional literacy is becoming more valued, especially in intimate connections. Women are more empowered to ask for clarity, honesty, emotional presence. But if a man has spent decades learning to suppress precisely those things, we shouldn't be surprised when he doesn't know how to show up in that way. At least not immediately. This isn't a question of emotional deficiency. It's a question of emotional education, or rather, the lack of it. And here's the tragedy. Many men do feel deeply. They crave love, connection, intimacy, but they've been trained to express it in indirect or dysfunctional ways, through acts of service, through sexual pursuit, through withdrawal, even through silence. The irony is painful. The very thing they fear, rejection for being emotionally open, is what ends up sabotaging the connection they so desperately want. Does that mean you wait around hoping he figures it out? No, you are not a therapist, nor a rehabilitation center for the emotionally repressed. But understanding this dynamic helps you detach from taking his silence personally. It's not always about you. It's often about him and the emotional cage he's still living in. Here's the truth. Silence in men is often the echo of what they were never allowed to say, but craving without voice is a prison, and no one deserves to be loved from behind bars. There's a truth that isn't often spoken aloud, but it's vital to understanding male silence in the context of desire. Sometimes craving isn't exciting, it's terrifying, not because the woman being craved is threatening, but because what she represents is transformative, and transformation requires surrender. And for many men, surrender is synonymous with losing control. This is where we hit the deeper psychological wall. Control. Men are often taught to measure their worth by how much control they can maintain. Control over emotions, over outcomes, over their careers, even over other people's perceptions. The illusion of mastery becomes a stand-in for actual inner strength. So when a man begins to crave someone, not just in a physical sense, but in a visceral, soul-level kind of way, it destabilizes his inner order. He's no longer at the center of his emotional universe. Now there's someone else whose presence evokes uncertainty, need, even dependency. That can feel intolerable to someone whose identity is rooted in self-containment. So what does he do? He pulls back. He goes quiet, not because the feeling isn't real, but because it's too real. He begins to see the woman not just as a person he desires, but as a potential catalyst for profound change. And here's the paradox. Change is what many people say they want, but only up to the point that it threatens the structures they've built to protect themselves. He may crave her presence, but fear what her presence demands of him. Intimacy demands self-revelation. It demands he confront parts of himself he's carefully managed, denied, or buried. In this sense, his silence is not just about her. It's about what she evokes. She might unconsciously awaken the very parts of him that he's worked his whole life to keep under control. And that's not romantic. That's not soft music and candlelight. That's deeply unsettling. He may begin to fear that if he opens up to her, he will no longer be able to maintain the version of himself he's relied on. The composed, self-sufficient man, the man who doesn't need anyone, the man who's always got this. And to lose that persona, even if it's an illusion, can feel like death. But here's the hard truth. If a man craves you, yet goes silent, he is choosing to maintain control over pursuing connection. He's deciding that preserving his ego is more urgent than exploring the bond. That decision doesn't make him evil, it makes him human, but it also makes him unavailable. Sometimes the silence has nothing to do with you as a person and everything to do with what you represent. And this distinction is crucial. A woman who is craved deeply, who stirs something real in a man, often symbolizes more than attraction. She can become a mirror, not just a mirror to his desires, but to his limitations, his brokenness, his aspirations, his unresolved wounds. And when that happens, you cease being just someone he wants, you become someone whose presence demands he confront who he really is. Now think about what that means for a man who has spent years avoiding that confrontation. A man who has carefully constructed a life that keeps his inner world in check. He may have routine, status, even success, but none of that guarantees wholeness. Often, it conceals the absence of it. And then you enter the picture, not just with beauty or charisma, but with depth, with clarity, with emotional presence. And that kind of presence disrupts everything. He may begin to feel things he can't explain, longing, vulnerability, even inadequacy. You don't just appeal to him, you challenge the story he tells himself about who he is. Maybe he always thought he wasn't the kind of man who needed deep connection. Maybe he believed he was too damaged to be known. Or maybe he's always defined relationships as transactional, nothing more than control or conquest. And now, suddenly, you make all of that feel false. Not by what you say, but by who you are. That level of confrontation can be overwhelming. It's not just about fear of rejection, it's fear of change. And not just any change, but identity level change. To be with you, to truly engage with you, he might have to grow, mature, heal, let go of cynicism, take emotional risks. That's not light work. That's psychological excavation. And most people, men and women, don't do that unless they're absolutely ready. But if he's not ready, silence becomes his shield, not because he doesn't care, but because care has consequences, and he may not be willing or able to face them. When a woman is truly seen, not as a fantasy, but as a force, an emotional and spiritual force, some men will retreat. Not because she's too much, but because she demands too much of them. Not through pressure or demand, but simply through her presence. She forces him to ask questions like, who am I when I'm not performing? What am I avoiding? Can I actually show up for someone in a real way? Those are hard questions, and silence is a convenient way to avoid answering them. So when he craves you and disappears, understand he might not be running from you. He might be running from the version of himself he'd need to become in order to stand beside you. And that version? That's the man you deserve. Don't settle for his silence while he avoids becoming him. There's another dimension to male silence that we need to consider. Something less about avoidance and more about uncertainty. Some men are not withdrawing out of fear or ego or emotional paralysis. Some are simply waiting. Not passively, not carelessly, but cautiously. They're watching, sensing, analyzing, and often what they're waiting for is permission. Not in the literal sense, but emotionally. Permission to step forward, permission to risk, permission to expose a part of themselves they've spent years protecting. Now you might wonder, why would someone need permission to express interest, to speak, to connect? The answer lies in a profound psychological reality. Men, especially those with past wounds or with a deeply analytical nature, often hesitate not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much and they don't know if it's safe to act on it. Emotional safety is rarely talked about for men, but it's real. In the absence of clear, open, reciprocal signals, many men default to silence. Not because they're uninterested, but because they've learned that misreading a woman's emotional openness can lead to rejection, or worse, humiliation. This becomes even more true if he's had experiences where vulnerability wasn't met with warmth, but with criticism or coldness. So he waits. He waits for your body language to soften. He waits for your tone to invite, not defend. He waits for some indication, however subtle, that he won't be punished for caring. In this way, many men approach love the way a soldier approaches a minefield, carefully, alertly, and always scanning for danger. This isn't about weakness. It's about wiring. Men are often wired for precision in action, in career, in problem solving, even in conflict. So when the emotional realm becomes ambiguous, when feelings are involved but not clearly expressed, they stall. Not because they're disinterested, but because they're looking for certainty. And here's the irony. In doing so, they often appear distant, detached, even indifferent, when the truth is they're highly attuned to your response. The silence in this case is filled with tension, not apathy. Now, does this mean it's your job to coax him into speaking? No, but if you sense the connection is mutual, if you feel his presence, even in his silence, it may be worth asking yourself, have I made it emotionally safe for him to step forward? Not by chasing him or over-accommodating, but by being open, curious, grounded. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of softness to signal that it's okay to meet you halfway. But let me be clear, waiting for a signal is one thing, waiting forever is another. At some point, if he's emotionally mature and genuinely interested, he must act, he must speak, he must choose. And if he doesn't, then the silence is no longer about uncertainty, it's about unwillingness. Craving someone is not the same as committing to them. If he's waiting for a sign, be sure you're not stuck waiting for a man who's never going to move. At a certain point, we have to tell the truth plainly. Craving without action is still avoidance. It doesn't matter how deeply someone feels for you, how drawn they are to your presence, how much you stir their longing. If they do nothing with those feelings, they remain inert. Craving in itself is not a virtue. It's not commitment. It's not love. It's potential energy that never becomes kinetic. And in the emotional realm, potential, unexpressed, becomes stagnation. Now, this is where many people get stuck, particularly those who are intuitive or empathetic. You sense the desire, you feel the depth, you know there's something there. And because of that, you wait, you justify, you interpret the silence as a phase, a wound, a hesitation he just needs time to work through. And while that may be true in isolated cases, there's a hard reality that needs to be acknowledged. If a man feels something for you, but chooses not to express it, pursue it, or act on it in a meaningful way, he is making a choice. Silence is a form of speech. It's not always indifference, but it is information. We must remember that human beings reveal their priorities through behavior, not just emotion. And emotion, for all its intensity, doesn't build relationships. Action does. Craving can stir the soul, but it doesn't raise children, build trust, resolve conflict, or nurture a partnership. That requires presence. It requires effort. It requires the willingness to step out of the internal world and enter the shared space of vulnerability with another person. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some men fall in love with the idea of you. They fall in love with the safety of admiring you from afar, of fantasizing without responsibility, of craving without cost, because craving alone allows them to feel without the risk of failure, exposure, or effort. But you're not here to be a figure in someone's inner monologue. You're not here to be longed for but never claimed. If he craves you but stays silent, if he doesn't reach, speak, act, or rise, you have to ask yourself, what am I actually participating in? Because at some point, longing turns into a loop, and you end up orbiting around a connection that was never grounded in real-world presence. There is a profound difference between a man who is emotionally available but cautious and a man who is emotionally invested but immobile. One is navigating, the other is avoiding, and that distinction matters. Because while one may slowly build something real, the other will keep you stuck in a narrative of almosts and what-ifs. So let me leave you with this. Emotional depth means very little if it never leaves the interior world. If he cannot translate craving into action, silence into speech, desire into direction, then he may feel for you, but he is not choosing you. And love, at its core, is a choice. Not a mood, not a craving, a choice to show up out loud, in full, every day.